Okay, so now we go to the gospel. Still in Mark, this is the story of the Transfiguration. You need to know about this pericope since it's, pulled out of the whole gospel of Mark. You need to know that this Transfiguration story happened actually 6 days after Jesus' first prediction of his passion. So that's significant. So after Jesus announces what is going to happen to him, within 6 days, this happens, okay? Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. Peter, James, and John, kind of the big three, right? The ones that are often together with Jesus at significant points in his story. So again, it is those three. You're going to hear some similarities in this pericope to the baptism of Jesus and also to his agony in the garden. And you're also going to see in the Transfiguration part of this, you're going to see similarities to the Theophany of God to Moses on Mount Sinai, Mount Sinai, at which Moses receives the 10 Commandments. So theophany means how God shows God's self. So with Moses, the theophany was, he was at the top of a mountain, there was a cloud covering it, and there was a tent at the bottom of the mountain for it. So Moses, mountain, cloud, and tent are all from the 10 Commandments story, which are going to be kind of part of this story that remind us of that. So you're going to hear some things that remind you of the baptism of Jesus, that remind you of the agony in the garden, and that remind you of the story of Moses getting the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. Now, here's a really cool thing. Most scripture scholars believe this, that this pericope, this section that we're going to hear, this account of the story, actually describes a fleeting moment in which the three, Peter, James, and John, got it about who Jesus was as Messiah. So it was like one of those aha moments, like, they go like that. This was one of those moments. This story is actually telling about a moment of illumination for Peter, James, and John. Okay, so high mountain, I already said that it's like Mount Sinai. You could say then that Jesus is the new Moses, if you make that correlation. Transfigured. This is an apocalyptic word. Apocalyptic means it's looking straight ahead towards the future when the kingdom will be here and God will reign in glory. So that's an apocalyptic word. And his clothes became dazzling white, such as no fuller on earth could bleach them. Dazzling white in scripture always means like otherworldly or glory. Then Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were conversing with Jesus. So historically, Elijah stands for prophecy and Moses stands for law, because Moses got the 10 Commandments and Elijah was a prophet. Now, none of this, of course, would be lost on Peter, James, and John. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, like the Sinai Theophany. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. So this is what Peter's trying to do. He's trying to preserve the presence, the eschatological presence of Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. He's trying to preserve that, externalize that. Okay, let's stop it. Remember how last week I talked to you about this? I said the biggest temptation of the 40 years in the desert was always to stop and hunker down and make this permanent. And that wasn't the point of the desert. It was always keep on moving till we get the goal, Okay, well, it's the same thing that's going on here. Peter is going, Rabbi, let's make 3 tents. In other words, let's keep this. This is good. Let's not let this get away from us. The temptation is always to lock in. And the invitation from God is always keep coming. He hardly knew what to say. They were so terrified. It was a mixture of terror and joy, I think, Then a cloud came, cloud meaning presence, just like at the top of Mount Sinai when Moses was receiving the commandments. The people at the bottom of the mountain looked up and saw the cloud and knew it was the presence of God. So cloud means presence of God came. Oh, now here's a wonderful part. Casting a shadow over them. This is really important. These 3 guys are not just observing something that is mind-blowing. They are deeply involved in this whole mystery of glorification. They are not on the margins. They are in the dynamic. That is so beautiful. From the cloud came a voice. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. Now that was said at the baptism, wasn't it? Except that was said about Jesus, to Jesus, to Jesus. When we talked about the baptism pericope, I said in Mark, at any rate, the voice is just for Jesus. But here, the voice and the message is for Peter, James, and John. This is my beloved son. Do you see the moment of like, aha, okay, we get it. And not only that, even for a moment, even momentarily, they were able to hold in their understanding Jesus being the Messiah here and Jesus predicting that he would die. For a hot minute, they were able to hold that in themselves. It didn't last because we're very rarely just on a straight directional vector. Most often we're up and down and strong and weak and sure and doubtful and all that. But they had this moment. Suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone but Jesus alone with them. So notice, Jesus is alone, which means Elijah and Moses give their places up to Jesus because they are only the servants. They cede their position to Christ. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus charged them not to relate what they had seen to anyone, except when the Son of Man had risen from the dead. I'm going to stop there and ask if you remember, I've talked for a couple times about in Mark's gospel, this pattern that keeps coming up of what is called the Messianic Secret. Jesus will cure or Jesus, a demon, will rise up and say, I know who you are, Jesus of Nazareth. You are the Messiah. And Jesus goes, hush. Or he cures somebody and says, don't tell anyone. There's always this keeping that quiet. Mark's point being, don't mix up the miracles and the exorcisms with the real point of Jesus coming. Now, this is a little bit different because there's a condition on it. Jesus charged them not to relate what they had seen to anyone except when the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So now it's clear when this won't be a secret anymore because that could never be kept a secret. This is the only time in Mark's gospel when you can foresee an end to the Messianic secret. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what rising from the dead meant. Okay, now takeaways from this. Transfiguration happened obviously to Jesus, but actually transfiguration happened to Peter, James, and John as well. They had to, the fact that I said this was, even if it were momentary, a grasp, an understanding of who Jesus was. Even if for a hot second they got it for that second. And that is a transfiguration for them as well. Now, this transfiguration was not so much about who Jesus was, but about who he's connected to. And it's right here. The voice from the cloud says, "This is my beloved Son." The transfiguration is about relationship. Everything important that God does is about relationship, connectedness, communion. Now, that's good news, because remember when I said this part right here that I'm showing you, casting a shadow over them, the same shadow, the shadow from the cloud that indicated presence, this phrase right here, casting a shadow over them, it is a way of saying, and I'm repeating this part because it's important, they weren't casual or terrified observers. They were deeply involved in this manifestation of glory that happened. That's the good news of this. We participate in this relationship, in this connectedness, in this communion. We participate in that. And the minute we forget that, then the good news goes away. So what's a takeaway? Maybe one takeaway is, do not overreact to bad news. You're never sure where you're going to be led, even in difficult times. What you must always believe is that God is involved in your life. That's what you must always believe. Second thing, this also hooks back to the beautiful story of Abraham. What we can offer in our surrender can be transfigured into something more lasting and perfect than it ever was before. Abraham and Isaac both have a very close calling with God on their mountain. And so do Peter, James, and John. They have a very close coming together experience of communion, also on a mountain. Now, Abraham, Isaac, Peter, James, and John are all five going to go down from their respective mountains into the usual down at the bottom of the hill living of their lives. The hill was intimacy, intimacy, intimacy. And what they had there was real. But all five of them went down their two separate mountains back into the everyday. So obviously, the last thing that was said right here. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what rising from the dead meant. Questioning, questioning, questioning. That, I think, is an appropriate word to describe the posture of our lives, our spiritual lives. We're always, and we need to, be questioning, questioning, questioning what things mean. Now, for some people, they look for that. They try to investigate what the questioning is by looking in the Bible. Great place to look, because it's the story of God's ceaseless reaching out to people because of this need and desire and identity of communion. That's what God is. That's what we are, because we image God. Anytime we forget that and get lost, God is ready and willing to embrace us back into the communion again, no matter how many times. But we have to remember that God is always part of our lives, always part of our lives. So I think what we have to do in trying to question, I think we have to remember that we have to try to do the questioning correctly. What I mean by that is we have to try to understand God's messages to us correctly. And here are two barometers, I'll say, to guide you as you go forward into this questioning. One is this: never focus on one saying of God in isolation. So you don't take the Bible and open it up, close your eyes, open it up and go, okay, that's my message for the day. Don't ever do that. Don't ever do that. While you may want to memorize that message of the day, fine. But I'm speaking about understanding God's messages to us correctly. Never focus on a saying of God in isolation. That's why I go, probably most people think too far over the top, to try to give you context for this, because that enriches the message. Never focus on one saying of God in isolation. And the second thing is, you must never only listen to what God says. You must also remember who God is. I think those are two great guides as you keep doing this questioning, which is part of our spiritual life. Very, very, very important.